There are moments in life when everything you've ever learned, every skill you've buried, every promise you've made comes down to a single choice. For Richard Maxim, that moment came at 37,000 feet when a voice crackled over the intercom asking if anyone on board had combat flight experience. He'd spent 8 years trying to forget he was a pilot. But on Flight 847, forgetting wasn't an option anymore. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Richard Maxim wasn't supposed to be on that flight. He'd missed his original connection in Denver because his daughter Lily had called him crying about a nightmare she'd had the night before, about him falling from the sky. He'd spent 40 minutes on the phone in the airport terminal reassuring her, promising her he'd be home safe, promising they'd make pancakes together Sunday morning like they always did. By the time he hung up, his flight was boarding and he had to run through the terminal with his carry-on bouncing against his hip, his tie loose around his neck, his gray suit rumpled from the 2-day conference he'd just attended. He made it to the gate just as they were about to close the door. The gate agent barely glanced at him as she scanned his boarding pass. Seat 14C. Middle seat. Economy. He squeezed past a woman reading a magazine and a businessman already asleep against the window. Nobody looked at him. Nobody ever did. That's what happens when you spend 8 years working as a logistics analyst for a medical supply company. You become the kind of person people's eyes just slide past. Forgettable. Safe. Exactly what he'd wanted to be. But Richard hadn't always been invisible. 12 years ago he'd been Captain Maxim, call sign Reaper, flying F-16 Fighting Falcons out of Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. He'd logged over 1,400 hours in fighter jets, had flown combat missions in 3 different countries, had trained younger pilots how to handle a plane when everything went wrong. He remembered the feeling of pulling 9GS in a tight turn, the way his vision would narrow to a tunnel, the way his body. Richard was dozing when the first jolt hit. It wasn't dramatic, just a sudden shudder that ran through the fuselage, the kind of turbulence you feel a dozen times on any flight. The businessman next to him jerked awake. A few people looked around nervously. Then the plane shuddered again, harder this time, and the overhead bins rattled. The seatbelt sign dinged on. A flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, calm and practiced. "Folks, the captain has turned on the seatbelt sign. We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Richard glanced out the window. It was dark outside, but he could see the wing clearly in the light spilling from the cabin. Something about the way it was vibrating didn't look right. He'd spent enough time in cockpits to recognize when an aircraft was struggling. Then he heard it, or rather, he heard the absence of it. The engine noise, that constant low roar you stop noticing after the first few minutes of any flight, had changed. It was uneven now, sputtering. The businessman next to him was gripping his armrests, knuckles white. "Is this normal?" he asked. Richard didn't answer. He was counting seconds in his head, listening. 10 seconds. 15. 20. The engine noise dropped even lower. Some passengers were starting to notice now, starting to murmur. A woman across the aisle said to her husband, "Something's wrong." Then the intercom crackled again, but this time it wasn't the flight attendant. It was a male voice, strained and urgent. "This is First Officer Collins. We're experiencing a serious mechanical situation. We need everyone to remain calm and stay in your seats. Flight attendants, please take your seats immediately." The cabin went dead silent for 3 seconds, and then chaos broke loose. People started talking over each other, some shouting. A baby started crying. Someone yelled, "What's happening?" A flight attendant rushed past Richard's row, her face pale. The plane lurched again, this time dropping what felt like 100 feet in a single stomach-dropping second. Someone screamed. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling with a collective whoosh. Richard's training kicked in automatically. He grabbed his mask, secured it over his face, made sure the woman next to him had hers on. He was breathing steadily, evenly, even as his heart hammered in his chest. Around him, people were panicking, fumbling with their masks, crying, praying. The businessman next to him was hyperventilating. Richard put a hand on his shoulder. "Breathe slowly," he said, his voice muffled by the mask. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. You're okay." The man nodded, tried to follow his instructions. The intercom crackled again. "This is First Officer Collins. Captain Hunter has been incapacitated. I repeat, the captain is incapacitated. We have lost hydraulic pressure in our primary flight control system and our left engine is failing. I need to know immediately if there is anyone on board with significant flight experience. I need someone who has flown large aircraft or has military aviation background. If you have this experience, please identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately." The words hung in the air like smoke. Richard felt his whole body go cold, then hot. Around him, people were looking at each other, desperate hope in their eyes. Someone shouted, "Is there a pilot? Somebody has to be a pilot." Richard closed his eyes. Lily's face flashed in his mind. Her smile. Her nightmare about him falling from the sky. His promise to make pancakes Sunday morning. If he stayed in his seat, if he stayed invisible, maybe they'd find someone else. Maybe there was another pilot on board. Maybe the first officer could handle it alone. Maybe. But he knew better. He'd heard the fear in the first officer's voice, the technical details he'd shared. Loss of hydraulic pressure. Engine failure. That combination was a death sentence without someone who knew what they were doing. He thought about his wife Sarah, about the choice he'd made 8 years ago to be a father instead of a warrior. But what kind of father would he be if he stayed in his seat and let everyone on this plane die, including himself? What kind of man would that make him? What would Sarah have wanted him to do? A flight attendant was making her way down the aisle, asking people if they had flight experience. A young man 3 rows up raised his hand. "I have my private pilot's license," he said. "I've logged about 80 hours." The flight attendant grabbed his arm, relief flooding her face. "Come with me." Richard watched them go. 80 hours in what? A Cessna? A Piper? This was a Boeing 737 with failed hydraulics and a dying engine. That kid was going to get them all killed. His hand was reaching for the call button before he'd consciously made the decision. The businessman next to him stared at him. "What are you doing?" Richard pressed the button. A different flight attendant appeared, a black woman in her 40s with kind eyes that were currently filled with terror. "Sir, please stay seated. I'm Captain Richard Maxim, United States Air Force retired," he said quietly. 1,400 hours in fighter jets, trained in emergency procedures and manual flight control systems. Tell your first officer I can help him." The flight attendant's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" "Ma'am, I'm very serious. And we don't have much time." She grabbed his arm the same way she'd grabbed the young pilot's. "Come with me. Right now." Walking up that aisle felt like walking through water. Everything moved in slow motion. Faces turned toward him as he passed, pale and frightened, looking at him like he might be their salvation or their doom. They couldn't tell which. A woman grabbed his arm as he passed. "Can you save us?" she asked, her voice breaking. He looked at her. She had a wedding ring on her finger and a photo of two small children tucked into the seatback pocket in front of her. "I'm going to try," he said. It was the only honest answer he had. The young pilot with 80 hours was standing near the cockpit door, looking relieved and terrified at the same time. "They said they need someone with more experience," he said to Richard as they passed each other. "Someone who's flown big planes." Richard nodded at him. "You did the right thing volunteering." The flight attendant leading Richard, her name tag said Karen, was speaking rapidly as they approached the cockpit. "The captain collapsed about 5 minutes ago. We think it's his heart. We have a doctor looking at him now, but he's unconscious. First Officer Collins has been flying solo, but he's young, only been with the airline 8 months. He's never dealt with anything like this." Richard filed away the information. Young first officer. Limited experience. Multiple systems failing. This was bad. The cockpit door swung open. The scene inside was worse than Richard had imagined. Captain Hunter, a man in his 60s, was slumped in the captain's seat, his face gray, his breathing shallow. A man Richard assumed was the doctor was checking his pulse. First Officer Collins, who couldn't have been more than 26, was in the right seat, both hands on the yoke, sweat pouring down his face. The instrument panels were lit up like Christmas trees, warning lights flashing red and amber everywhere Richard looked. "Sir, my name is Richard Maxim," he said, keeping his voice level and calm. "Air Force Captain, retired. F-16 pilot. I'm here to help you." Collins turned to look at him, and Richard saw the naked relief in his eyes. "Thank God. Thank God. Can you fly a 737? I've never flown this specific aircraft, but I know the principles. All aircraft follow the same laws of physics. Talk to me about what we're dealing with." Collins's words came out in a rush. "We lost our primary hydraulic system about 6 minutes ago. We're down to the backup, but it's giving us maybe 30% control authority. The left engine just spun down to idle thrust and won't respond to throttle inputs. We're at 34,000 feet right now, but we're descending about 300 feet per minute. I've declared an emergency with ATC. They're clearing airspace and giving us vectors to the nearest suitable airport. That's Kansas City, about 90 miles southeast." Richard looked at the instruments, his brain automatically processing information the way it had been trained to do 12 years ago. Altitude, airspeed, heading, vertical speed, engine parameters, hydraulic pressure. It all came back like he'd never left. "How much fuel do we have?" 8,000 pounds. About 40 minutes at current consumption. Passengers and crew. 143 passengers, 5 crew. Richard did the math in his head. 148 lives, including his own, including the woman with the photos of her children, including the businessman who'd been sleeping peacefully next to him 20 minutes ago. "Okay," he said. "First thing we need to do is get the captain out of that seat. Doctor, how is he?" The doctor, a South Asian man in his 40s, shook his head. "He's had a major cardiac event. He needs a hospital immediately, but he's stable for now. Moving him is fine." Between the doctor, Karen the flight attendant, and another male flight attendant who'd appeared, they managed to carefully lift Captain Hunter out of his seat and carry him into the cabin. Richard slid into the captain's seat, still warm from the unconscious man's body. The yoke was shaking under his hands, the plane fighting him. He scanned the instruments again, this time with the practiced eye of a pilot, not an observer. What he saw made his stomach drop. The hydraulic pressure was dropping even in the backup system. They were losing it. And the left engine wasn't just at idle, it was degrading. Temperature was climbing. If it ceased completely, they'd have one engine and almost no hydraulic control. That was a crash, not a landing. "Collins," he said, "I need you to talk to ATC. Tell them we need a straight-in approach to the longest runway Kansas City has. Tell them we're declaring a full emergency. Possible hydraulic failure, possible single-engine landing. Tell them to have every emergency vehicle they have standing by." Collins nodded, his hands shaking as he reached for the radio. While he talked to air traffic control, Richard's hands were moving across the instrument panel, checking systems, trying to understand what they were working with. The plane shuddered again, a deep metallic groan running through the airframe. Outside the cockpit windows, Richard could see the wing flexing, the failed engine silent and dark while the right engine screamed, trying to compensate. He thought about Lily. He thought about the promise he'd made to her this morning, the promise to come home safe. He thought about Sarah, about the day he'd resigned his commission and promised himself he'd never put his life at risk again. But here he was, 34,000 feet in the air in a dying plane, with 147 other people counting on him to remember how to do something he'd spent 8 years trying to forget. "Sir," Collins said, "ATC says runway 19 is clear. 2,700 meters. ILS approach available. Emergency crews are standing by. They want to know our fuel state and if we can maintain altitude. Tell them we've got 35 minutes of fuel and we're descending whether we want to or not. Tell them we're going to need every inch of that runway." Richard's hands tightened on the yoke. The plane was getting heavier, fighting him more with every second. The backup hydraulic system was at 15% now. Soon they'd be flying this thing with raw muscle, manually forcing the control surfaces to move. He'd done it before in a simulator, in an F-16 with hydraulic failure. But that was a small jet designed to be agile. This was a commercial airliner weighing 70 tons. "Collins, I need you to do something for me," Richard said. "I need you to go back in the cabin and I need you to brief the flight attendants on emergency landing procedures. Tell them we're going to come in hot and we're going to come in hard. Tell them to prepare the passengers. Brace positions, secure loose items, review evacuation procedures. Can you do that?" Collins looked at him, and Richard saw the conflict in his face. The training that said never leave the cockpit during an emergency, and the practical reality that Richard needed him to do this. "Sir, I should stay here, I know. But I need someone who knows this aircraft to brief the crew. I'll be okay up here for 5 minutes. Trust me." Collins unbuckled his harness, stood up on shaky legs. "You can really do this." Richard met his eyes. "I'm going to do everything I can. Now go. We're running out of time." Collins left, and for the first time in 8 years, Richard was alone in a cockpit with nothing between him and the ground but his skill, his training, and his will to live. The plane shuddered again, dropping another 100 feet in a sickening lurch. The hydraulic pressure gauge flickered. 8%. 7%. Richard's hands were steady on the yoke, even though his heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. This was it. This was the moment. Everything he'd been. Everything he'd tried to become. Everything he'd promised his daughter. It all came down to the next 30 minutes. He keyed the radio. "Kansas City approach. This is Monarch Air 7847. We are proceeding direct for runway 19. Be advised we are now in manual flight control mode. Hydraulics are critical. Requesting continuous approach guidance." The controller's voice came back immediately, and Richard could hear the tension in it. "Monarch 847. Kansas City approach copies. You are cleared for the approach. Wind is light and variable. Visibility unrestricted. Runway 19 is clear and available. All emergency equipment is standing by. We have you on radar. Vector heading 140, descend and maintain 8,000. 140, descend to 8,000, Monarch 847. Richard adjusted the heading, felt the plane resist him, the ailerons barely responding. Every input he made on the controls had to be exaggerated, forced. It was like trying to steer a truck with failed power steering while driving through mud. The next 20 minutes were the longest of Richard's life. Flying a crippled aircraft with almost no hydraulic pressure was like wrestling a living thing that didn't want to be saved. Every correction took all his strength. The yoke required so much force to move that his arms were burning after the first 5 minutes. Sweat was running down his back, soaking his shirt under his rumpled suit jacket. The plane wanted to roll left because of the dead engine on that side. The asymmetric thrust from the working right engine was trying to yaw them into a spin. Richard had to constantly fight to keep the nose straight, keep the wings level. Every few seconds the plane would try to dip, try to roll, and he'd have to manhandle it back. It was exactly like flying a fighter with hydraulic failure, except this plane was 50 times heavier and 100 times less forgiving. Collins came back into the cockpit, his face pale. "Cabin is secured. Flight attendants are briefed. Passengers are in brace positions." "Good," Richard said through gritted teeth. "I need you in your seat. When we get close to the runway, I'm going to need you to handle the landing gear and flaps manually. The hydraulics may not work." Collins slid into his seat, buckled his harness. "What can I do right now?" "Tell me the speeds. What's our approach speed for this aircraft with this weight and configuration?" Collins pulled out a laminated card, ran his finger down it. "With our current fuel state, approach speed should be 140 knots. Landing speed 130. We're going to be coming in faster than that. Probably 160. I won't have enough control authority to bleed off speed safely." "Sir, that's too fast." "I know. But it's our only option. Tell me the stall speed." 98 knots clean, 112 knots with landing configuration. Richard did the math. If he came in too slow, they'd fall out of the sky. Too fast, and they'd run off the end of the runway. The margin for error was about 10 knots either way. In a plane that barely responded to control inputs. With one engine. He'd made tougher landings before. The lie tasted bitter even as he thought it. Monarch 847. Kansas City approach. You're 40 miles out. Begin your descent to 4,000 feet. Turn left heading 120. Descending to 4,000, left to 120, Monarch 847. Richard eased the yoke forward, felt the plane's nose drop. But it dropped too fast, the nose pitching down steeper than he wanted. He pulled back, had to use both hands, his arms shaking with the effort. The nose came up sluggishly. They were descending at 800 feet per minute. Too fast. If they came in at this rate, they'd hit the ground before the runway. He adjusted the power on the working engine, trying to fine-tune the descent rate. The plane shuddered, protesting every change. Outside the cockpit, he could see lights below them now. They were over the city, over Kansas City. Somewhere down there, people were having dinner, watching television, living normal lives, completely unaware that a broken plane was clawing its way down out of the sky above them. In the cabin behind him, 143 people were sitting in brace positions, praying, crying, saying goodbye to loved ones on their phones. Karen, the flight attendant, had told him before he left that some passengers were writing messages to their families, just in case. Just in case this didn't work. Just in case Richard couldn't do what he'd promised. He thought about Lily, about her nightmare of him falling from the sky. He thought about the text message he'd sent her before takeoff. Love you bigger than the sky. His wife Sarah had started that when Lily was 2 years old. How much do you love me? Lily would ask, and Sarah would say, bigger than the sky. And Lily would say, how much is that? And Sarah would spread her arms as wide as they would go and say, all the way from here to forever. Sarah was gone, but Lily was still there, waiting for him to come home and make pancakes on Sunday morning. He couldn't let this plane fall. He couldn't let these people die. Not on his watch. Not when he was the only one who might be able to save them. Monarch 847, you're 20 miles out. Turn left heading 105. Descend to 2,000 feet. You are cleared for the visual approach runway 19. Report when you have the runway in sight. Left to 105, descending to 2,000, Monarch 847. The city lights were brighter now, closer. Richard could see the airport, the string of approach lights leading to the runway. He could see the red and white emergency vehicles lined up along the taxiway, waiting. I have the runway, he said. Monarch 847. Roger. You are cleared to land runway 19. Wind calm. Good luck. Collins looked at him. What do you need from me? When I tell you, I need you to manually extend the landing gear. There's a handle next to your right knee. When I tell you, pull it. Then I need you to manually extend the flaps to 15 degrees. That's going to make the plane want to balloon up. Be ready for it. Roger. They were at 2,000 feet. The runway was 5 miles ahead, a strip of lights in the darkness. Richard could feel every muscle in his body tensed. This was it. This was the moment. Everything he was, everything he'd trained for, everything he'd promised to Lily, came down to the next 3 minutes. Gear down, he said. Collins pulled the manual extension handle. There was a metallic clunk, a shudder, and the landing gear indicators changed from red to green. But the plane immediately started rolling left, the increased drag from the gear pulling them off axis. Richard fought the yoke, his arms screaming, forcing the plane back level. Flaps 15, he said. Collins moved the flap lever. The plane ballooned up, gaining 100 feet of altitude they couldn't afford to lose. Richard pushed forward on the yoke, but it took everything he had. The plane dropped back down, too fast, the sink rate climbing to 1,200 feet per minute. They were falling like a brick. 3 miles. 2,000 feet. The runway was right in front of them now, but they were coming in too steep, too fast. The ground proximity warning started blaring in the cockpit. Pull up. Pull up. Pull up. Richard ignored it. He adjusted the power, trying to shallow out their descent. The plane responded sluggishly. They were at 1,000 feet. 800. 600. The runway was rushing up to meet them. Collins was gripping his armrests so hard his knuckles were white. Sir, we're too fast. I know. 400 feet. 300. The runway threshold was right there. Richard pulled back on the yoke with every ounce of strength he had. The nose came up slowly, reluctantly. 200 feet. 100. They crossed the threshold at 155 knots. 25 knots too fast. The main landing gear hit the runway with a bone-jarring impact. The whole plane shook. Richard immediately deployed the speed brakes and put the right engine into reverse thrust. The plane was still screaming down the runway at 130 knots, eating up concrete. The end of the runway was ahead, 2,000 meters away, then 1,800, then 1,600. They weren't slowing down fast enough. Richard stood on the brakes, felt them grab, felt the anti-skid system cycling, felt the tires starting to smoke. 1,500 meters. 1,400. 1,300. 100 knots. 90. 80. They were going to make it. They were actually going to make it. At 40 knots, with 300 meters of runway left, the plane finally rolled to a stop. The cockpit was silent except for the warning chimes and Richard's ragged breathing. Collins was staring straight ahead, his face the color of chalk. Richard's hands were still locked on the yoke, his whole body shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. Outside, the emergency vehicles were racing toward them, lights flashing. Richard keyed the radio. Kansas City Tower, Monarch 847 is on the ground. We're going to need medical for the captain and we're going to need tugs. We have no hydraulics for taxi. Monarch 847, welcome to Kansas City. Emergency crews are approaching now. Outstanding work. Richard unbuckled his harness, his hands shaking so badly he could barely work the clasp. Behind him, he could hear the sound of the cabin erupting in cheers and applause and crying. Someone was shouting, "We're alive! We're alive!" He stood up, his legs unsteady, and turned around. Through the open cockpit door he could see the faces of the passengers, see the relief and joy and disbelief written there. He saw the woman with the photos of her children, crying and laughing at the same time. He saw the businessman who'd been sitting next to him, hugging a complete stranger. He saw Karen the flight attendant, tears streaming down her face, mouthing thank you at him. Collins was standing next to him. "Sir, that was the most incredible flying I've ever seen. You saved all of us." Richard shook his head. "We saved them. You kept it together when your captain went down. That's what made this work." The next 2 hours passed in a blur. Medical teams came aboard and took Captain Hunter away on a stretcher. The passengers were evacuated down mobile stairs onto the tarmac. Richard watched them go, watched them hug their families who'd been rushed to the airport, watched them cry and laugh and hold each other. The FAA was there within 30 minutes, wanting to know what happened. The airline executives arrived. Local news cameras set up behind the security fence. Richard gave his statement to the investigators, describing the mechanical failures and his decisions in the clinical language of someone who'd been through accident inquiries before. They asked him about his background. When he told them he was a retired Air Force fighter pilot, their eyes widened. "Why were you flying commercial?" one investigator asked. "I work in logistics now," Richard said. "I fly commercial because that's what civilians do." They asked him to stay in Kansas City for a few days for follow-up questions. He called his boss, explained the situation. His boss had already seen it on the news. "Richard, I had no idea you were a pilot. You never mentioned it. It wasn't relevant to my job." "Well, it's relevant now. Take all the time you need. You're a hero." Richard winced at the word. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who did what needed to be done because no one else could. That's not heroism, that's just responsibility. The airline put him up in a hotel near the airport. By the time he got to his room, it was after midnight. He sat on the edge of the bed, still in his rumpled suit, and pulled out his phone. 23 missed calls. 15 text messages. Most of them from his brother, his coworkers, neighbors who'd seen his name on the news. And 3 from Lily. The first one, sent at 6 p.m. "Daddy, are you okay? The news says there was a plane crash." The second one, sent at 7:30. "Daddy, please call me. I'm scared." The third one, sent at 9:15. "Uncle Tom says you saved everyone. He says you're a hero. Is that true? Are you really okay?" Richard's hands were shaking again as he called her. She picked up on the first ring. "Daddy." Her voice was high and scared and so relieved it made his chest ache. "Hey, baby girl. I'm okay. I'm safe. You saved a whole plane. They showed it on TV. Everyone was talking about it. Mrs. Henderson from next door came over and said you were on the news." Richard closed his eyes. He'd wanted to keep her safe from this part of his life, from the part of him that flew fast and took risks and lived on the edge of disaster. But there was no hiding from it now. "Lily, I need to tell you something. Do you remember how I told you I used to fly cargo planes in the Air Force?" "Yeah." "That wasn't exactly true. I flew fighter jets. I was a fighter pilot. And today, when the plane I was on had problems, I had to remember how to do that job again. I had to help fly the plane because the captain got sick." There was silence on the other end. Then, in a small voice, "You lied to me?" "No, baby. I just didn't tell you the whole truth. I didn't want you to worry about me. I didn't want you to think about me doing dangerous things. After Mom died, I promised myself I would always come home to you. And I've kept that promise. I did come home. But you almost didn't." The words hit him like a physical blow because they were true. He'd come within seconds and feet of not making it home, of breaking his promise, of leaving her alone. "I know," he said quietly, "but I did. I made it. And I will always do everything in my power to make it home to you." Another pause. Then, "Daddy, were you scared?" He thought about lying, about telling her he wasn't scared at all, that he had everything under control. But she deserved better than that. "Yes," he said. "I was very scared. But I did my job anyway." Mrs. Henderson says that's what heroes do. They do the scary thing anyway. Richard felt tears pricking at his eyes. "I'm not a hero, Lily. I'm just your dad. But you saved all those people. The news said 148 people are alive because of you." He thought about the woman with the photos of her children. The businessman who'd been sleeping peacefully until everything went wrong. Karen, the flight attendant with the kind eyes. First Officer Collins who'd held himself together even though he was terrified. All those lives, all those stories, all those futures that would have ended if he'd stayed in his seat. "I guess I did," he said. "So what does that make you?" Lily asked. "A pilot," Richard said. "It makes me a pilot." They talked for another 20 minutes, Lily telling him about her day at school, about her friend Emma's birthday party next weekend, about the math test she was worried about. Normal things. Safe things. The kind of conversation they had every day. When they finally hung up, Richard sat on the edge of the hotel bed and stared at his hands. They were steady now, no longer shaking. These hands had pulled 9GS in a fighter jet. These hands had guided a broken airliner to the ground. These hands had made pancakes every Sunday morning for 8 years. He thought about who he'd been and who he'd tried to become and who he actually was. Maybe you couldn't separate the parts of yourself. Maybe the warrior and the father weren't different people. Maybe they were just different ways of being the same person. His phone buzzed. A text from First Officer Collins. "Sir, I just wanted to say thank you again. Captain Hunter is stable. Looks like he'll recover. And the airline wants to offer you a position. They need experienced pilots. They need someone like you. If you're interested, call this number." Richard stared at the message for a long time. A position. They wanted him to fly again. Professionally. Regularly. To go back to being a pilot, not just a man who used to be a pilot. 8 years ago he'd made a choice. He'd chosen to be a father over being a warrior. He'd chosen safety over risk. He'd chosen a quiet life over the life he'd loved. But maybe that had been the wrong choice. Or maybe it had been the right choice for then, but it wasn't the right choice anymore. Lily was older now, 13 years old, not 5. She was strong. She could handle having a father who flew planes. And Richard realized something sitting in that hotel room. He'd been lying to himself for 8 years. He'd told himself he was being a good father by giving up flying, by being safe and invisible and always there. But maybe being a good father meant showing his daughter who he really was. Maybe it meant teaching her that you don't have to hide the parts of yourself that are strong or brave or capable. Maybe it meant showing her that you can be more than one thing. You can be a warrior and a father. You can make pancakes on Sunday and fly a plane through a crisis on Tuesday. You can be afraid and do the job anyway. He picked up his phone and dialed the number Collins had sent. A woman answered. "This is Richard Maxim," he said. "I'm calling about the position." 3 days later, Richard walked through his front door in Chicago. Lily came running down the stairs and threw herself into his arms so hard she almost knocked him over. He held her tight, breathing in the smell of her shampoo, feeling her heart beating against his chest. "I made pancake batter," she said when she finally pulled back. "I wanted to be ready for when you got home." "That's perfect," Richard said. "Let's go make pancakes." They stood in the kitchen together, the same kitchen where they'd stood every Sunday morning for 8 years. Richard poured the batter onto the hot griddle. Lily was chattering about school, about the news coverage, about how all her friends wanted to know about her hero dad. He let her talk, flipping pancakes, watching them bubble and brown. But then she went quiet, and when he looked over at her, she was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Daddy, are you going to fly again? Like really fly? Not just be a passenger?" He'd been thinking about that question for 3 days. He'd accepted the airline's position. He'd start training in 6 weeks. He'd told his boss at the medical supply company that he was leaving. He'd started the process of coming back to life as a pilot. But he hadn't told Lily yet. Now he set down the spatula and turned to face her fully. "Yes," he said. "I'm going to fly again. The airline offered me a job, and I said yes. I'll be a commercial pilot. It means I'll be gone more than I have been. I'll be flying routes, sometimes overnight trips. But I'll always come home. Always. That's a promise I can make." Lily was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she said, "Is it because of Mom?" The question surprised him. "What do you mean?" "You stopped flying when Mom died. I remember. We moved here and you got the boring office job and you never talked about the Air Force anymore. Was it because you were sad?" Richard felt his throat tighten. His 13-year-old daughter had seen more than he'd given her credit for. "Yes," he said. "I was sad. And I was scared. I was scared something would happen to me too, and you'd lose both of us. So I tried to be the safest possible version of myself. I tried to be someone who would never put you at risk." "But you can't be safe all the time," Lily said. "Nobody can. Mom died in a car accident. She was just driving to Aunt Julie's house. You can't hide from bad things. She was right. He knew she was right. You couldn't bubble wrap your life. You couldn't prevent every disaster." Sarah had died on a Tuesday afternoon on a clear day on a road she'd driven 100 times. There was no preparing for that, no way to make it safe. "No," he said. "You can't hide from bad things. But you can choose how you live with them. And I chose to try to be small and invisible and safe. But this week showed me that's not who I am. I'm a pilot, Lily. That's part of who I am, and I can't hide from it anymore. And I don't want to." Lily nodded slowly. Then she stepped forward and hugged him again, harder this time. "I'm proud of you, Daddy. For saving all those people. And for being honest with me. I like knowing who you really are, even if it's scary sometimes." "I like knowing who I really am too," Richard said. "I'd forgotten for a while there." They finished making the pancakes together. Lily set the table. Richard poured orange juice. They sat down across from each other, the same way they'd sat every Sunday morning for 8 years. But something was different now. The man sitting across from Lily wasn't hiding anymore. He wasn't pretending to be someone smaller and quieter than he really was. Richard picked up his fork, then stopped. "Hey, Lily. How much do I love you?" She grinned, the same grin her mother used to have. "Bigger than the sky." "How much is that?" "All the way from here to forever." "That's right," Richard said. "And nothing, not even flying, will ever change that. Not ever." They ate their pancakes. Outside, it was starting to rain. The weather report said there might be storms later. Richard would have to check the forecast. Old habits were coming back, pilot habits. Checking weather. Thinking about wind speeds and visibility. Planning ahead. But for now, for this moment, he was just a father having breakfast with his daughter. A father who also happened to be a pilot. Both things. At the same time. Finally. 6 months later, Richard was back in the air. Not in a fighter jet this time, but in a Boeing 737 flying routes across the country. Captain Richard Maxim. He'd gotten his type rating, passed all his check rides, completed his line training. The airline made a big deal about hiring him, the man who'd landed the broken plane. But after a few weeks, the headlines faded and he was just another pilot doing his job. He flew to Seattle and Denver and Atlanta and Miami. He came home between trips and made pancakes with Lily on Sunday mornings when his schedule allowed. He started dating again, a teacher named Janet who thought it was impressive that he was a pilot but wasn't impressed by him being in the news. He bought a new suit. He joined a gym. He slowly came back to himself. First Officer Collins called him sometimes, just to check in. Captain Hunter recovered fully from his heart attack and retired. The FAA investigation concluded that a catastrophic hydraulic failure had been caused by a manufacturing defect. The airline implemented new inspection protocols. Life went on. But Richard never forgot that flight. He never forgot the woman with the photos of her children, or the businessman who'd been sleeping peacefully, or Karen the flight attendant with kind eyes. He never forgot the feeling of that yoke in his hands, the weight of all those lives depending on his skill and his training and his will to bring them home safely. And sometimes, when he was flying at altitude, cruising smooth and steady above the clouds, he'd think about his wife Sarah. He'd think about the choice he'd made 8 years ago and the choice he'd made in that Kansas City hotel room. He'd think about what it means to be a father and what it means to be a pilot, and how maybe those aren't opposite things after all. Maybe being good at both means being fully yourself, all the parts of you, the brave parts and the scared parts and the competent parts and the parts that just want to make pancakes on Sunday morning. Maybe that's what Sarah would have wanted for him. Not to hide. Not to be small. But to be exactly who he was, completely and unapologetically. So he flew. And he came home. And he flew again. And every time he did, he kept his promise to Lily. He came home. Always. Because love isn't just bigger than the sky. It's bigger than fear. It's bigger than tragedy. It's bigger than the distance between 37,000 feet and the ground. It's all the way from here to forever. And that's a promise worth keeping. So tell us, what would you have done? If you were in seat 14C, if you'd spent 8 years trying to be invisible, trying to be safe, and suddenly everything you'd buried came calling, would you have stood up? Would you have walked to that cockpit? Would you have risked everything to save people you'd never met? Think about the skills you've hidden, the parts of yourself you've locked away because they felt too dangerous or too complicated or too much. What would it take for you to let them out again? What would it take for you to be fully yourself? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that the parts of themselves they've buried are never really gone. They're just waiting. Waiting for the moment when the world needs them to stand up and be exactly who they really are. Subscribe for more stories that remind us what it means to be human. Until next time, this is the voice over the radio, signing off.